Now, you may know that there is a new Indiana Jones movie just been released after Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Temple one, the name has gone from my head, Crystal Skull, etc. There's a new one, and there have been numerous fake posters suggesting that given the fact that Harrison Ford is now 80 years old, the new movie should be called Indiana Jones and the Afternoon Nap. Now, people who are of any age, we like an afternoon nap. We like to rest. In which case, today's sermon is really good news because it's based on what Jesus says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." So rather than Indiana Jones and the afternoon nap, what we have here is Jesus Christ and the wonderful rest. There is much to learn here, so don't take a morning nap, but stick with it as we learn about these wonderful words of rest and how in Jesus and in Jesus alone we will find that rest. Firstly, we should note the width of Jesus' offer. It's open to all, an open invitation. Come one, come all. There is no qualification. You don't have to come from Hobart or from Glenorchy or from across the river. You don't have to be Anglican. You don't have to be Presbyterian. You don't have to be Catholic. It's an open, completely open invitation to all to come and find rest. The only qualification is that you understand that you're weary, that you need that rest. And we might then think, well, what is it that makes people weary? What is those heavy burdens of which Jesus speaks, and what is it that makes us weary? I started to write a little list, and it became fairly quickly a long list of the things of which might make us weary. There are those things that impinge upon us from the outside, those expectations upon us as to how we are to behave, that old idea of group peer pressure or keeping up with the Joneses or whatever the name of your neighbours are, needing to do the things that everybody else is doing. And the more we try to do that, the harder it is and the more weary we become. In religious terms, this is called legalism. And it does seem to have been a problem in the first century Judaism. The very next chapter will highlight the problem as Jesus and his disciples do good to someone, but in doing good they have broken the law, which is supposedly bad, and so the religious authorities have a go at them. Jesus in the Gospel will speak of the way in which the religious leaders have placed heavy burdens on people and they do not offer a finger to help them. Now, legalism has never been far away from the Christian church either. Many of us may have grown up with understandings of things that Christians did, or to be more precise, usually didn't do, as the way in which you kept in God's good books. So you didn't dance, you didn't play cards, you didn't watch the Sunday movie, you went to church all the time. I had to miss Countdown every week. Yes, I'm speaking out of my own pain here. You didn't go Sunday shopping, which was easier because shops weren't open on Sunday. You ate fish on Friday. All these things that you thought you had to do to stay in God's good books. And as Paul discovered in Romans 7, the more you try to live up to those standards, the worse it gets. The more you realise that you don't, and so the worse you feel and the wearier you become. Yet Jesus continually mixed with those who didn't live up to religious expectations. He had meals with them. He befriended them. He got to know them. He did it so often he got called a drunkard and a glutton, i.e. not a good Baptist. And yet he befriended them and called them to follow him. He didn't wait for them to come up to his expectations, up to his standards. He just welcomed them and said, "Come to me." It is this Jesus who says, "Come to me and rest." All are welcome. The invitation is to all. It may not, though, be expectations from others external to us that cause us to be weary. It can be our own expectations that weary us. Perhaps we are burdened by guilt as we do not live the way that God calls us to. Yet Jesus says, "Come to me." He is the one who forgives all, even those who are crucifying him. He forgives us and teaches us how to forgive. It is in his forgiveness that we can rest and lay down our burdens. We may be burdened as to whether we have any real value. Recently, we looked at the idea of Jesus' statement about even the very hairs on our head are numbered. Now, I've done a little test this week. I suggested to you when I did that sermon about God recognises our haircuts that nobody ever recognises when I have a haircut. You've all failed. None of you have noticed that I've had a hair. I did it deliberately to see whether anyone would, but I was wearing a beanie for most of the time, so it's perhaps a little unfair. But God noticed. God notices our haircuts. God notices who we are. We are valuable before God. We can rest in the value that we have before God. We may be burdened by worries, yet Jesus reminds us not to worry, but to trust in God's provision and his care. We can trust him to look after us. We may be wearied by grief, but in the resurrection there is hope of a world in which there are no mourning or crying or pain or tears. We can let the grief go as we come to Jesus. We can, of course, simply just be tired. And it is great to remember that Christianity is not a religion of works, what we do, but of trusting in what Jesus has done. And we rest in that. Christians should not be busy people. We should be restful people, which means it's okay to take some time off and go and see a movie. But we can go a little deeper than that, however. Jesus uses the word rest, and when he does so, he knows he's using a theologically loaded term. To understand this, we need to do a little bit of biblical theology, that is, looking at an idea all the way through the story of the Bible. Now, I spoke at Emmanuel Christian School on Friday to ages from about 6 up to about 14. It was absolute chaos. I got there, I realised they were all much younger than I was anticipating, so I kind of had to throw my notes away and make it up as I went along. And we did a little quiz. And I'll see how you guys go. In the book of Genesis, God makes the world in how many days? Oh, you're much better than them. Good. Most of them said 7. I had to go, mah, mah, mah. He did it in 6 days. And what did he do on the 7th day? He rested. Okay? And all the way through the Genesis story, you have there was evening, there was morning, the 4th day, or whatever, the 5th day. You don't get one of those with the 7th day. The 7th day remains open, as if the Bible is telling us right at the very beginning that we are made for rest. We are made to be God's people in God's place under his commands. That's what it is to be at rest. And you get that throughout the rest of the Old Testament. In Exodus, the people are taken to a place of rest, the promised land. In Psalm 95, the promised land again is pictured at being at rest. In the book of 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, when the kingdom of Israel is at its peak, it is described as being at rest. God's people in God's place under his command. In the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, this idea is picked up and reminds us that there still awaits a rest for us as we look forward to the new creation where everything will be put right, where everything will be at rest. And we are to start living that life now. We are to be God's children in God's world under his rule. So we are created for rest. Rather than striving to be something other than we are made for, in Jesus we are free to be the people that God intended us to be, looking forward to that new creation where all will be put right and everything will be at rest. This helps us understand why Jesus can talk about wearing a yoke, which sounds like there's still work to be done. Well, biblically, rest is not about having a break and being stationary, but rather living the way that God has intended us to live. Not wearying ourselves, but rejoicing in the life that God has called us to. Not working against what God wants us to be, which is very wearying and makes us tired, but rather living as we're called to be. Rest is not about indolence, but living with significance and hope. It means we can take a break from trying to work out how we are supposed to live and simply live as God has called us to and living it properly. This is the wonderful invitation of Jesus. Rest from guilt, rest from expectations, rest from worry, rest from trying to work out how we're supposed to live, and rather living the life that God has called us to. Who wouldn't want this? Well, the most obvious answer is those who don't think they need it. Those who don't think they need a rest, who will not admit they need to rest and come to Jesus. Perhaps this is because we are so busy that we don't give time to think about whether we need rest. Or perhaps, if we're honest, we keep ourselves busy so we don't need to think about whether we need that rest. If we think we're doing quite all right by ourselves, then we will not come to Jesus. For coming to Jesus to rest means we can't do this by ourselves. It's an admission that we need something that he offers, not something we can do for ourselves. Calvin puts it this way: failure makes us fit to receive his grace. It's only when we know we can't do it that we will come to him for that which we need. If we are to come to the promised rest, we need to wake up to ourselves, stop having an afternoon nap, and realise that we need this rest. But if you notice, there is not only one qualification, there are actually two. Not only do we need to realise that we are weary, but we need to notice that Jesus doesn't say, everybody chill, just sit back, relax, binge watch a few movies. He doesn't say that. That's not how you rest. Come to me. We can't miss the hero of the story. To do so would be like going to see an Indiana Jones movie, but there's no Indiana Jones. The hero of this story is Jesus. It's Jesus and the wonderful rest. Not just a message of wonderful rest, but Jesus Christ and the wonderful rest. For this extraordinary offer, this magnificent, awe-inspiring invitation, a summons to life in all its fullness, comes from coming to Jesus. Not even coming to God, notice. It's coming to Jesus that we find these things. And the more we look at what's said here, the more outrageous it seems. For Jesus talks about taking upon himself his yoke. Now, no Jewish rabbi would talk this way. They would speak about take upon yourself the yoke of the law. And they would talk about how taking on the yoke of the law would give you rest. But Jesus doesn't say take upon yourself the yoke of the law, but take upon yourselves my yoke. He is saying that he is replacing, being more important than the law of the Old Testament. The way we are God's people now is to trust in Jesus. He has said as much with the astounding statement that we had earlier in our reading, that all things have been given to him by the Father. And the way which people will come to understand and know who the Father is, who God is through Jesus. This claim by a Galilean carpenter should be hard for us to hear. Compare Socrates' statement, if you take my advice, you will think very little of Socrates and much more of the truth. Don't look at me, look at the truth. Well, Jesus says, actually, look at me because I am the truth. He makes himself completely central to the message. It is in Jesus and only with Jesus that we find this rest, knowing what life is about, finding forgiveness and significance. We may look for those things elsewhere, but ultimately they will make us weary and burdened. Some, of course, will find this offensive to make Jesus so central, but not believing who this is to miss the invitation. This invitation by Jesus is not from the Jesus that we may want, but it's the Jesus who is really there, who is really here, and makes this offer to you and to me. So coming to Jesus, if we are to receive this rest, means we may have to change our preconceived ideas of who Jesus is. For it's only as the one who forgives, it is only the one who teaches of forgiveness and significance that we find this rest. It will, of course, maybe even change our ideas about God. Of course, in the passage that we've had, that is to accept these things not as thinking ourselves wise, but as little children, rejecting self-reliance and self-importance and trusting Jesus. The encouragement to take this self-denying step of looking to Jesus is to look at all his ministry, his teaching, but most importantly, his death and his resurrection. These all back up his claims that he has the power to deliver on this promise. He got up from resting in the grave so that we may know that we can rest eternally in him. Do you need to hear this message of rest? Is your religion making you tired? Is your work making you weary? Are your expectations exhausting you? Then hear Jesus' gracious invitation. And perhaps today, for the first time, as you take the bread and the wine, hear him say to you, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest."